Hello, welcome to This Week's World, the show tasked with bringing global thoughts to Saturday afternoon television with a cast of big thinkers. We have the editor of Vice News, who coined Chemsex Week, and the geostrategist who's redrawing the world map along 21st century themes. They'll be reviewing the week's news with me. And we're in conversation with Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner who's trying to escape a title he hates, the Mother Teresa of economics. We ask him what he makes of London's super rich. But our main story takes us to South Africa. Has Jacob Zuma squandered the legacy of Nelson Mandela? He may face 800 charges of corruption. The man once described as the conscience of South Africa, Desmond Tutu, thinks it's time for President Zuma to go. Does the ANC agree? We'll ask them. So what happened? Jonathan Rosenthal is the Economist Africa editor. Why does all this matter now?
This is the country that in 1994 averted what everyone thought was going to be a racial war. You know, it transitioned to democracy and was an inspiration to much of the world. 22 years on, its economy is grinding to a halt. It's potentially going over a cliff. It's about to potentially face a debt downgrade. And you've got a president who is frankly, sort of not in the model of Mandela. He has been criticised by the Constitutional Court. He has got a party that is riven by factional differences. What has happened in these 22 years?
Jonathan, thank you. They both fought injustice. They were both imprisoned on Robben Island. They both went on to become president. Yet their legacies cannot be more different. Mandela gave South Africans their freedom. How will President Zuma be remembered?
The ANC is the oldest liberation party in Africa. Founded just 2 years after South Africa was united into one country after the Boer War.
Which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid.
Apartheid is formalised.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies.
The ANC is banned shortly after the Sharpeville massacre of 69 black people, and a radical Nelson Mandela forms its military wing, MMUSI. Jacob Zuma joins.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
A year later, Mandela is arrested, put on trial for treason, and sentenced to life in Robben Island.
Large crowds gather to watch the accused being driven away to start their life sentences.
After 27 years in jail, Mandela's released, given the Nobel Peace Prize, and goes on to become South Africa's first black president, advocating reconciliation.
To be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
Thabo Mbeki takes over from Mandela. ANC support peaks at nearly 70% of the vote. Charismatic, popular Zuma is his deputy. June 2005, Zuma's fired after he's linked to fraud involving his financial advisor and charged with corruption. The charges are later dropped. Separately, he's also acquitted of rape. In December 2007, his comeback. After a bitter contest, he's elected party president and moves against Mbeki, forcing him to stand down. In 2009, Zuma becomes president of South Africa. But ANC support stops dropping and rivals emerge. Zuma's key ally, Julius Malema, starts his own party, the EFF. And the once white Democratic Alliance gained black support. The last few months have left Jacob Zuma embattled. With allegations that he allowed controversial businessmen, the Gupta brothers, to influence political decisions. The Constitutional Court found he used government money to renovate his private home. Now it looks like 783 corruption charges against him could be reinstated. And the latest scandal? Media claims that the stretched police budget was used to buy 10 luxury vehicles for President Zuma's 5 wives.
In South Africa, the ANC and democracy are synonymous. So despite the controversy around President Jacob Zuma, the ANC is still winning elections. But for how much longer? We went on a journey around the country to find out what people think. This is rural KwaZulu-Natal. It's where Jacob Zuma was born. 66-year-old Nani Gaba says Zuma has changed her life.
Uyazenza izinto uyasho ngomlomo wakhe impela ufuna kwenza into ethile nento ethile ngisafika impela la mina ngiyafika kule ndawo ngisafika la cha kwashesha impela amanzi ashesha ngena awungabona cha kwasheshe kwalunga.
And this is why the majority of poor South Africans keep voting for the ANC. But the upcoming elections will be a crucial test for President Zuma. Spesihle Zulu is mayor of Mandeni, one of the local municipalities. The country is having elections in August. We asked him if people should still vote for the ANC.
We have done extremely well. People are now accessing water who were not accessing water before. We have built kilometers of roads.
There are reports of divisions within the party from a national level. It's not a well-functioning house. So why should people still be confident in a party that seems to be failing to run its own internal affairs?
The ANC is a people's organization. It has to listen to the people. The ANC is a beacon of hope.
But it's also here in rural KwaZulu-Natal where Jacob Zuma's biggest problem lies. You're looking at the president's private home. It cost taxpayers $20 million. It's said to be one of the most expensive houses in the country. It has become a symbol of reckless government spending, a lack of accountability, and sheer corruption. The president's home has been his biggest headache, the scandal he just could not shake off. And if the ANC decides to cut him loose, that sprawling homestead would have been what started it all. Young people were at the forefront of the fight against apartheid, and now it is the youth, the born-free generation, those born after the end of apartheid, who are taking a stand. They want free education for poor students, something the ANC promised when it took over in 1994. This is Rhodes University, a historically white university. It's changed over the years though and has become a lot more mixed. But black students in 2016 have launched a fresh wave of protests. They say they are still being financially excluded from attending prestigious universities such as this one. But this is not a story just about Rhodes. This is something that has resonated in universities across South Africa. Black students say their parents are still financially unable to afford for them to attend universities such as this one, hence the rise of black power. Laika Wa Azania is part of the born-free generation, but says oppression is as alive now as it's ever been.
Our generation is not going to be the one that says, we will vote for the ANC no matter what the ANC does. We are the one who says only if the ANC does something right, we will vote, and if it doesn't, we are going to remove them. We deserve more, we deserve better, and that I would accept something like this if it was coming from a white government that has always regarded me as a lesser human. But for it to come from an ANC government that fought so hard, by the way, for us to be liberated as black people, for it to do the things that it does to us, which were being done to us by the apartheid government, it hits at a part of my heart that is too deep. And the pain when it happens is colossal.
And that pain is spreading. Next, we visit Limpopo, a province key to Zuma's rise to power. Anger boiled over here recently. Although the protests were around government decisions on local planning, the residents burnt down more than 20 schools. This affected 60,000 students. And I've covered a lot of stories and visited a lot of schools in rural areas and urban areas, but I don't think I've ever seen anything like this. You can still smell the ash, and over there you can see some books that are still burning. It's just chilling. It's quite chilling to see. Eric Mashao, 74, has lived in Vuwani all his life. He tells me he is heartbroken about what has happened here.
In my life, I don't think I'll see I can see another thing more than this one. This is worse. If Mandela was here, I'm sure what was he going to do?
You think he would have done something about the situation?
Something with this situation. Yeah, because it can't be like this.
Now, 22 years after the end of apartheid, this country's hard-fought and young democracy is being tested. Phumza Fihlani, BBC News, South Africa.
So if South Africa's democracy is being tested, does Zuma have to go? I spoke to Zweli Mkhize, the ANC's treasurer, the man closest to Jacob Zuma, and asked him for his honest assessment. In March of this year, the Supreme Court unanimously decided that Jacob Zuma had violated the Constitution through his use of public money. That was a terrible moment for your country and your party.
That issue was relating to the powers of the public protector. This was an issue that was not as clear before as it was when the Constitutional Court...
It was pretty clear to the public, wasn't it? He spent money on renovating his houses, he built an amphitheatre, he built a swimming pool, he used public funds.
I think that issue of renovations is something that gets done. There were things that went wrong with this one, in particular the nature of the supervision and the specifications and the hiking of the prices. So we agree that those things were wrong. They needed to be attended to. When the Constitutional Court made a ruling, the Constitutional Court reaffirmed the recommendations of the public protector and said that there must be repayment of some of the stuff and that ministers must be reprimanded. That is actually happening, and there was an agreement that that would be the case.
But you know that there is pressure on Jacob Zuma from all sides to resign now.
I think the day you get praises from the opposition parties, you will have to look at yourself. So it's a robust democratic dispensation. The opposition and anybody has the right to say whatever they wish to say. The matter has to be dealt with. When it was taken to Parliament, you needed the Parliament to make whatever ruling there is. There'll be some who are unhappy with it, there'll be some who are happy with it. But the fact that it is open, you know what? You could never say any of such things about any minister or any leader of government and still survive. Today, you can say anything you want to say. That Constitution protects you. To us, there's a big strength. So you can say whatever you want to say, respect and defer to the institutions that are supposed to deal with those issues. Your views are one thing, but what those institutions decide are another thing.
But at some stage, you have to listen, because that advice comes from friends. It comes from friends like the South African Communist Party, a long-time ally of the ANC, who say that the court's ruling amounts to a decisive action, now imperative. Otherwise, the continuing loss of moral authority, political paralysis and fragmentation of our movement will continue. That's the way this is going, that if Zuma doesn't step down, the whole legacy, the whole movement lies in ruins.
It's not about Zuma only, it's about a whole issue of a number of issues. If you look at all those statements, they relate to the decisions that we've taken in our National General Council of the African National Congress in October.
Isn't the moment when you see how scared the markets are right now and how low the rand is and how fragile the economy is to say, we will give you confidence by clearing up our political system? That's where we have to start.
The call for president to resign is something that happens in many countries when you've got an economic strain in a country. Greece next door actually had 3 elections in 18 months and one prime minister was elected 2 times. The issue is that once you've got an economic depression of some sort, people will actually target your president, they'll target your ruling party, they'll target the government because they think that something wrong has been done by that group. And therefore, that's we expect. But you can't then push the country into further instability by taking actions that might actually create more problems. You need to pull people together. You need the country more united. You need to turn the corner, and then you can deal with issues of who you change and what have you. As far as we are concerned right now, we actually believe that there is something credible and positive that South Africa has done, and I think that South Africa must be given credit for that.
If people are starting to ask you
whether the ANC has lost credibility, it's lost what it set out to do, then isn't it right to say we have to sacrifice one man because the future of the ANC is more important?
Where I agree with you is that there is not one man who's more important than the ANC.
So if Zuma did go, then you would say the ANC could survive and flourish?
You can look back. You can look at Madiba, you can look at Mbeki, you look at Mkhize. There has never been a time when a South African president who comes from the ANC has not been criticized heavily. Madiba was taken to court. We were shocked that anybody could think of that. Madiba never got 100% of South African votes. Whatever people can say, they like him so much. Madiba got 69% of the votes at the time, and I can guarantee you, if you had continued, you would not have gotten the same amount.
But it's gone backwards. It's got 34% unemployment, double that when you look at youth unemployment. The gap between those at the top, the richest and the poorest, is wider than ever.
Well, when the UK had 1% growth, how many jobs did you lose? When China, when we were at the recession, how many jobs? More than 5 million jobs China lost at that time. America, when they went down and was where the real problem started, how many jobs were lost? How many times the government had to step in to go and stabilize the banks, and they didn't call it nationalization, they went in and put in money there. How many times that did happen? Now, why should it be different if it happens in South Africa? The same thing happens all over the world. If it's South Africa, it must be different. 22 years of democracy, and all the changes that we've gone through, I think South Africa must be given credit.
Dr. Mkhize, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, if the ANC loses the next election, MMUSI is the man most likely to be South Africa's president. His party, the Democratic Alliance, is the biggest in opposition. Crucially, it's shedding its reputation for being a party for white liberals. Now, black voters disillusioned with the ANC join its ranks. Well, MMUSI joins us now, and a warm welcome to This Week's World. Thanks for joining us. You heard there from the ANC treasurer, who says essentially that Jacob Zuma will survive this.
It shows the fact that Jacob Zuma is no longer an exception to the ANC. Jacob Zuma, through a patronage network, has captured the entire organization. In fact, the leadership of the ANC now exists to serve Jacob Zuma. So it's, in fact, becoming more and more so that it's not about just the survival of Jacob Zuma. It's a question of how can we quickly and effectively get rid of the ANC, because this is no longer the party of Nelson Mandela. This is a party that has changed fundamentally. Now it's become, as what former President Thabo Mbeki described as an ignoble parasitic organization. And I think the symptoms thereof are starting to become more and more evident.
If it is a parasitic organization, why isn't your party cutting through?
We are. You can recall that we are already governing a major city, as in the city of Cape Town. We govern the province or the state that Cape Town is in. And in that space, we're showing more than anything our capability in being able to govern. Unemployment is on the decline there. We're also showing profound growth. If you look at the numbers as were reflected even in the last elections in 2014, we took the ANC from 64% to now 53%. Our party has grown now to become the most credible alternative for South Africans and an alternative from the ANC. So we are the alternate. We are the only party that that South Africans can look for as a change from the ANC. So I'm quite confident as I sit here that not only in real numbers of real substantive growth, but also in people, and the increase in our membership shows that we are growing, and we are growing across all sectors of society.
And yet the truth is that there is, you'll recognise, a loyalty to the ANC because of Mandela that goes way beyond party politics. It goes to the very fabric of the free country itself. That's almost impossible to break for you, isn't it?
It's a very significant thing that we've got someone like President Mandela, who is a fairly strong person here in South Africa, and South Africans and globally, people respect him. What has also become quite clear is that the ANC is busy on a project of undermining his legacy. And what we are starting to see is that more and more people are saying, yes, we honor our past, we honor Nelson Mandela, but we want to look for a future. 8.9 million South Africans cannot find work in this country. And in fact, when you even interrogate that even more, 60% of that are young people. And these are young people who, some of them have lived in an ANC government, yet they haven't experienced the true fruit of freedom. It's that generation of South African youth that we've got to present a future towards. And I think, whereas previously, if you looked at even the numbers as recent as 10 years ago, South Africans would have felt that we were heading in the right direction. But more and more now, more and more people are starting to feel like we're not heading in the right direction. And the economic indicators are there, the governance indicators are there, and more seriously, the corruption issue is starting to dismantle that legacy of President Nelson Mandela.
You need a substantial proportion of the black vote to do that. And for many black South Africans, that may seem treacherous.
I want to re-emphasize the fact that it's getting less and less so. Many black South Africans have an appetite for Mandela's vision of a non-racial party. And they can see that the ANC is spewing off messaging about saying, if you are black, you must be in this party. If you are white, you must be in this party. Whereas there are still South Africans who sit in there who say, I'm actually still attracted to a vision that only the DA is actually articulating of a South Africa for all races, a diverse South Africa. And yes, we do need a substantial part. And I'm not here saying to anybody that it's going to happen in these immediate elections. But what we've learned about liberation movements, even with great and powerful leaders, strong leaders such as Nelson Mandela, is that over a period of a 30-year window, they lose legitimacy with people because they fail to deliver on the most basic fundamentals. We see big man politics playing themselves out in Africa. We are seeing more and more of this race mobilization, and it's become an arsenal that the ANC is using more and more, which are indicators of a desperate party, buoyed by the fact that there's more numbers coming on board, and there's a diverse group of people who are saying, we're not going to settle for these polarizing views. We're going to come together under the DA, vote for the DA, because we believe that's the best vehicle to take South Africa forward.
MMUSI MAIMANE, thank you very much for joining us. Listening to that was Jonathan Rosenthal from The Economist. Do you think the opposition is right where they say this actually could spell the end of the ANC now, or has the ANC in power got a long way to go?
I think that a lot of rural voters, a lot of older voters still see the ANC as the party of liberation and the party of Nelson Mandela. So I think that one will see the opposition making gains in the coming local elections, and one will probably see them making further gains in 2019. But I don't think this is the end of the ANC by a very long shot.
Is it the end of Zuma? What happens to him now?
So that's the real challenge, because the ANC is deeply divided at the moment, and it's divided between a group of people who are happy to go along with the Jacob Zuma vision of the party, which I'm afraid to say he is turning into a patronage machine. The kind of serious part of the ANC now needs to make up its mind. Does it want to kind of pursue this man, not to the end of the party in the immediate term, but over the longer term? Yes, this is a turning point for the ANC, and it has to really choose which way it wants to go.
Jonathan, thank you. Now it's time for the stories of the week, and some you may have missed. This time, the week in hashtags.
Time for this week's World's Week in Hashtags, with a little help from our friends at BBC Trending. I Stand With Hate Speech has been trending across Europe and the US. This is not, in fact, as shocking as it might first seem. Reacting to a crackdown on hate speech by social media sites, users have been making the point that stifling free speech is bad, no matter how repugnant the views. Not everyone agreed. Try beating me lightly. In Pakistan, the Council of Islamic Ideology recently advised the government that husbands should be allowed to lightly beat their wives. In response, Pakistani women have been rallying behind the hashtag, outlining quite how they'd respond if someone tried to lightly beat them.
Try beating me lightly, and I'll make sure it's the last thing you ever do in your pathetic life.
No gulag for Darth Putin. After complaints, Twitter cancelled this parody account of the Russian president. Cue outrage. And before too long, the account was reinstated. Time to celebrate. Finally, this one's taken off again.
Get us out now.
A protester tries to burn down the EU flag, but because of EU regulations, it's flameproof.
Let's chat to our panel now. Rebecca Nicholson is the editor-in-chief of Vice, and PARAG KHANNA is the author and CNN contributor. Lovely to have you both here. PARAG, you've been looking at the world in maps and the rise of nationalism in particular.
Indeed, and Europe is ground zero for this, some might say, because it has more separatist movements than any continent in the world. You've been hearing, of course, about Scotland and Catalonia. Many people may not know that even Venice and Sardinia have had self-determination movements as well. Now, there are varying degrees of their push towards autonomy and independence. Of course, the ones I've just mentioned have not been allowed to by their national governments. Italy and Spain have been suppressing those efforts. But that said, they are becoming more and more autonomous. And what their plans include, of course, is that as soon as they would become independent, the first thing they would do is join the EU. And it's obviously a fascinating sense of perspective. While we're sitting here in London talking about Brexit, here are all these other movements that want to split away from countries in order to join the EU. And just as a point of fact, the EU is expanding. There are more countries that are actually lining up to join the EU, interestingly enough. So it's an interesting dynamic. Within the same continent, within the same cultural sphere as a whole, you have very different perspectives on what Europe means to them.
And Europe slightly bucking the trend compared to other parts of the world. Rebecca, drugs. You're going to talk to us about drugs.
Yes.
Legal highs, illegal highs.
Legal and illegal. There was a big survey that's been conducted over the course of 12 years in the United States. And one of the findings was that young people aren't smoking cannabis to the extent that perhaps their parents were, or that might have been expected, because obviously the US legalized medicinal cannabis use in 1996. They've been rolling out state by state a kind of broader attitude, shall we say, towards smoking cannabis. And the finding is that young people really aren't taking it up as much as would have been thought, which is in contrast to Europe. The European Drug Survey came out recently. It's an annual survey that measures attitudes towards drug consumption in Europe, and it's very much not the case there. Drug use doesn't seem to be declining in any way. And in fact, it's becoming more complex because of so-called legal highs, which are now, in the UK, illegal highs. Once again, it's synthetic drugs. But they have been made illegal thanks to the Psychoactive Substances Ban Act, which has banned anything in the UK now that has a psychoactive effect on the mind. So there was a dangerous moment at the beginning of discussions about this, when it was in bill form, when tea and coffee almost became banned in the UK because nobody thought that caffeine actually counted as a psychoactive drug, when in fact, of course,
somebody spotted that, presumably got a pay rise for spotting that just in time.
It was very close. We could have been a very different nation had our tea been taken away.
Another story that's sort of hitting the conscience this week is Uber, disruptive technologies. We've now seen Saudi coming in and taking a big stake on it, Parag.
Saudi Arabia and Goldman Sachs. I mean, as you know, whether it's sovereign wealth funds or corporate cash pools, there's a lot of cash out there that's been borrowed at low interest rates and is looking for these big disruptive companies to invest in that have reached a certain, or in the case of Uber, an enormous scale in a very short amount of time. So because Uber now wants to acquire larger and larger fleets of leased vehicles, there are companies or governments such as Saudi Arabia providing the capital to buy up and to lease out to Uber these vehicles. So now if you choose to become an Uber driver, you don't have to have your own car. In fact, you can just lease one at a very low cost, or even for free. It'll be subsidized indirectly by Goldman Sachs and Saudi Arabia and the other investors, and leased to you by Uber so that you can go out and join the Uber fleet.
And is your sense that the governments, Western governments, are going to start getting nervous about Uber now?
Well, as you know, they're already very nervous about Uber. This is only the next chapter. I won't even say a nail in the coffin. It's quite the reverse. Uber is winning more cases or situations or confrontations with municipal governments than it's losing. Here in Europe, obviously, there's a tough line that's taken because of the influence of regulators and taxi unions and so forth. But generally speaking, around the world, Uber is gaining and gaining market share on a daily basis.
Rebecca, brings us to my no link at all. Favourite story of the week, the vegan cafe bombarded by sausages.
Yes, this is in Tbilisi.
Georgia.
In Georgia. And I didn't realise that there would be a vegan cafe necessarily in Georgia, but there is. It's called the Kiwi Cafe. And protesters this week threw sausages onto the plates of apparently horrified diners, which is a very funny story and it has led to several amusing headlines about the kind of sausage attack. But there is a slightly more sinister undertone to it in that it was far-right nationalists who were attacking the cafe, and there had been reports that people had been in the cafe weeks before asking if it was frequented by LGBT customers.
So it totally political.
It was, it was
a
and it turned violent because obviously throwing sausages onto a vegan's plate may well turn violent. But so slightly sinister undertones to what appeared to be quite a comical headline.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for taking us through that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now it's time to think again. Our short strand where filmmakers give their spin. This one is about fear. Is it wrong to be scared of terrorism?
Today, we hear a lot about the politics of fear.
Fear. Terrorism.
Attacks against the West. That's nothing new.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We often think of fear as something toxic, something dangerous. It's to be avoided or repressed. And it's true. Irrational fear, most notably the fear of terrorist attacks, can have very damaging consequences. By being so afraid of terrorist atrocities, we tend to overstate the danger that they pose to our societies, and therefore we behave irrationally. From allowing fear to constrain the way we travel and live, to imposing draconian security measures and surveillance, to spending trillions on military adventures meant to make us feel more secure. But the truth is, in the West, the chances of being killed by terrorist attack are very, very small indeed. In reality, people are much more likely to be killed by heart disease, complications resulting from obesity, or just everyday domestic accidents. Meaning it would be much more rational to invest more heavily in, say, medical research than an endless security infrastructure. We need to ensure that fear is not simply a tool used by those who want to incite irrational hatreds and prejudices. We need to reclaim the politics of fear.
I'm joined now in our studio by Amartya Sen, one of the world's leading intellectuals, economist, philosopher. Here's some background.
Amartya Sen was born in India in the 1930s to a Bengali family. He was so moved by seeing famine while growing up, he devised practical solutions to prevent food shortage and starvation. His work on welfare economics earned him the Nobel Prize in 1998. He also devised new methods of measuring poverty and inequality, which have helped improve economic conditions for the poor. Rejecting the notion of GDP as the best measure of wealth and well-being, he helped create the UN Human Development Index. As a philosopher, he's cautioned against the extremes of identity politics, including in his native country.
Amartya Sen, welcome to This Week's World. Lovely to have you here. We've seen the emergence here in London of a global super-rich. The gap, it seems, has never been wider in terms of those at the top, those at the bottom.
The existence of rich people as such is not something that I find in itself an objectionable thing. I think it could be argued that in the democratic debate, there's a lot which is just anti-rich rather than pro-poor.
What sort of rhetoric are you hearing that says that to you? From whom?
Well, I think, by and large, I think Bernie Sanders has done a great deal to broaden American democratic discussion. So I admire him for that. On the other hand, in it, there is a tone which could be seen as being emphasizing the punitive aspect of dealing with the super rich rather than the supportive aspect of making the lives of everyone and the poorest much better. I think Bernie Sanders has raised a lot of interesting questions. At this time, I would wish that the battle lines were differently drawn, I think, and Bernie Sanders has really made some change in democratic politics, which I applaud and I would like to see. But I think the time for him to move on from there is, in my judgment, quite strong. It's quite nice to watch Trump, even though it's scary too. So it's exciting time. And you know, I'm 82 and I tend to think that we lead one life. So it's nice to have some excitement to see what's going on.
One of the debates we're having currently is about national identity and how we see ourselves here in terms of Brexit, the EU referendum.
Yeah. If you take a view, which seems to me easy to take, that it is possible to have a strong British identity along with a certain amount of pride in belonging to a big European entity. There's nothing wrong with that. If you think about the big thing that Britain did, for example, I mean, they did have a war. Nazi Germany was defeated. The big things that happened immediately after the war was National Health Service, welfare state. And in that, the British, who were being very innovative, were not only drawing on the richness of their own ideas, but they were drawing on Kant and Marx and Bismarck, who had all written about welfare state. And there was nothing, there was no contradiction between a Britishness with acknowledgement of a European presence in one's life.
Do you think that Britain could flourish under Brexit?
The argument that Britain can flourish better outside Brexit is simply mistaken. It's bad, based on pretty bad economics. And I think I'm quite surprised to see how many economists agree on that. Usually they disagree on most subjects.
Yanis Varoufakis said last week, economists get everything wrong. We didn't foresee the crash. We've now all predicted that Brexit will be bad. Why does anyone listen to economists?
Well, actually, I like Yanis a lot. But I have to say, I don't think it's quite the case. No one thought there was a crisis coming. They did not know when it would come, but there was a lot of the discussion as to how unsustainable the prosperity of the financial sector was. Now, that's an easy argument. Can Britain do better outside Europe than inside it? It cannot. I think it doesn't mean there will be a disaster, it doesn't mean there will be a famine, but it will do worse. That's not the main problem. The main problem is to deny a heritage which has made Europe what it is. I mean, the British and the French maybe when in imperial days, fighting in different parts in Africa and in my own country, in India, and so on. And yet they were drawing on a similarity of thought which crossed the channels all the time, you know. So I think if one misses out the way European cultures would have interacted with each other, then one is missing out a lot of the European part. That seemed to me to be a bigger issue. The economic issue is important since people often say, well, Norway didn't join European Union, doing fine. But, you know, not joining is quite different from quitting. Quitting, you know, the jilted suitor is never comparable to the unapproached partner.
And you think there would be revenge on the jilted suitor?
No, I don't think there would be revenge. There would be disaffection. There are all kinds of nice English words on that. I think I have to get my little glossary of Shakespeare out to see how many different ways you can express the thought, which is not a revenge, but which has an absence of love in it. And it's very important.
AMARTYA SEN, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Well, that is it for this week's World. You might remember, though, the question we asked last week, is Putin trying to break up the EU? It's become a most-watched video on the BBC site. One of those watching was Russia Today, the Russian government-funded TV station. They put out their own version, a spoof which they thought was funny. See what you think. Bye-bye.
So what's Putin actually accused of? Weaponising marine mammals. Russia plans to spend $25,000 on 5 bottlenose dolphins. Will they be trained to plant explosive devices on US and EU vessels? Moscow remains silent on the issue.